Max Lucado begins one of his books with a story of a man named Robert that he graduated from Abilene Christian with. Now, Robert graduating from college should have been the highlight of his career because he suffered from cerebral palsy to the point where he just had a hard time getting along. His voice didn't work the way that it should. His hands didn't work hardly at all. He had to have someone help him to get ready in the morning and to feed him. His clothes were held together with Velcro. But Robert graduated from Abilene convinced that God was calling him to be a missionary. And so he moved to Lisbon, Portugal, not knowing anyone in Lisbon, but God led him to a very nice restaurant owner who gave him a place to stay and helped him with his food. He ran into somebody that helped him learn the language, and within 5 years, he had led 70 people to faith in Christ. Robert was the last guy that you would have thought that God would call and use as a missionary. His shirts were held together with Velcro, but his life was held together with the joy of the Lord, and God called and used him in a mighty way. But that's just the way God works. Sometimes God calls and uses the very last person you would think of. We've been seeing that on Wednesday nights, and we've been studying the life of David. As Samuel was called to anoint one of the sons of Jesse to be the next king of Israel. And one by one, the sons of Jesse, strong, strapping, tall sons, walked in front of him. And every time Samuel thought, this has got to be the guy. And God said, that's not the guy. In fact, they had to pull the guy from the sheep pen because he was thought to be too small and scrawny to even show up for this job interview. God chose David. He told Samuel this, 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look on the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Quite literally, David was the last guy Samuel thought should be king, but he was the one that God chose. And then think about what happens when God was looking at resumes for somebody to send to be the apostle of the Gentiles. Who would God choose to be the special emissary that would take the gospel beyond Jerusalem and Samaria and then on to the uttermost parts of the world, largely Gentile parts of the world? You wouldn't think that somebody that had a resume like this would be the person that was chosen. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, a Pharisee, as for zeal, persecuting the church, as for righteousness based on the law, faultless. God picked out the most Jewish Jew Christian to be the one to send to the Gentile world. Paul would have been the very last person that we would have thought God would have chosen as an emissary to the Gentiles. I think he made a pretty good choice. God does that so often. He chooses the very last person that we would think. And sometimes the very last person he chooses is us. So we continue our look at the book of Judges that we're calling the vicious cycle because that's what it is. And we're going to see that this morning as the vicious cycle part of the book takes over in chapter 3. 2 or 3 times in the very first chapter, Israel is going to turn away from God and turn to idols. You need to understand that in the ancient world, gods and goddesses were thought to be attached to areas. And for example, in the Exodus, we run across the Baal of Peor. The Israelites had a problem with that, and they're punished. Some of them are punished because of that. Well, the Baal of Peor is simply the Baal god that resided in the area of Peor. So Israel moves into the promised land, and they get this brand new land flowing with milk and honey, but it's a land that is populated by all of these Baals and Asherahs, these fertility gods that are attached to the land. And they decide, well, if we want to be as fertile as we can be, if we want to be as successful as we can be in this new land, then as well as worshiping God, then maybe we need to keep the Baals and the Asherahs happy by worshiping them as well. But what would happen was the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord and their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs. And in keeping the Baals and the Asherahs happy, verse 8, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, the king of Aram Naharaim. That's northern Mesopotamia in some translations. That's a lot easier to say. Although if you think about it, Mesopotamia can be a tongue twister as well, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. So God had given the Israelites victory after victory in the conquest of Canaan that lasted for over 15 years. But now, because they're turning against God, he is withholding his hand so that now they are losing these battles and being overwhelmed by enemies. Well, what always happens is, now, you can make an argument, are the Israelites sorry that they have disappointed God, or are they sorry they're being overrun by enemies? I think you could argue maybe a little bit of both. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. We mentioned in the introductory lesson that the judge is not necessarily a judge in the law sense, but rather a deliverer. It's sometimes warrior, sometimes administrator, sometimes leader, but he is the one that God raises up to lead them to victory. And this one, the first one, was Caleb's younger brother, Othniel. Othniel came from a royal family in the sense that Caleb is very well known to the Israelites and well known to us. Joshua and Caleb were the two faithful spies that went into the land of Canaan and thought God can deliver us this land even though it has these walled cities and these giants that was scaring all the other Israelites. And so Caleb and Joshua are the only adult males that make it all the way from Egypt into the promised land. All of the rest died in the wilderness. And now Caleb, when he finally, as an old man, gets to the promised land, he asks for a special inheritance in Haran where the giants live. He had a score to settle with those giants that had cost him 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. He says, give me the giants. And so he leads Israel to victory over those giants. So now as Israel has turned away from God, the very first of the leaders that God calls up is this Caleb, who is or Othniel, who is the brother of Caleb. Okay, we skip 3 verses. And by the time we get to verse 12, it's happening again. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, the king of Moab, over to Israel. So now the Moabites are oppressing the Israelites. Once again, they leave the worship of God. Remember the first 2 commandments. Now, if I asked who can quote all 10 of the 10 commandments, how many hands would go up? But if I asked who can quote the first 2 commandments, most of us, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me, number 1. Number 2, you shall not build any graven images to Baal down. But you see, the Israelites, those were the 2 commandments they had the most problems with. And so once again, they're not going to stop worshiping God. They just want to worship these other gods as well, to fit in with the people around them, to ensure fertility of their land and flocks and herds. And God once again punishes them, this time by allowing the Moabites under King Eglon to punish them. He raises up Ehud. Othniel, Ehud is the second of the judges. And what we know of Ehud is he was the left-handed judge. And that's going to come into a very integral part of the story. About 10% of the population in most societies have that birth defect where they are left-handed. What's interesting, I ran across this week, in very stable and peaceful societies, only about 3% of the population are left-handed. But in warlike, upheaval-type societies, up to 27% are left-handed. So when you're in a scrap, you want a left-handed person. If you got to lead with your left, you want somebody that's got a good left hand, right? And that comes into play because Ehud is left-handed. And because of that, whereas most people were right-handed and wore their sword on the right hand, Ehud had made himself a sword and he wore it on the left. He's called in to King Eglon to bring the taxes and tribute to him. And he says, I've got a secret to tell you. So they send the guards off. And although he had raised up his robe to show that he wasn't armed, he then draws his sword from the other side and kills King Eglon, starts a rebellion that leads Israel to freedom. The moral of that story is never trust left-handers. That's not the moral at all. Now we come to the end of the Ehud story, and we're going to read the whole story of the next judge, Shamgar. Rather than just alluding to it, we're going to read the whole story. After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel. That's the whole story. That's all we know about Shamgar. It appears to be sort of an addendum to the Ehud story. And so in the introduction, when I said we have this cycle repeat itself 2 or 3 times, it may be that Ehud was serving as a judge at the same time as Shamgar. I mentioned in the introductory lessons that very often the service of the judges overlapped one another, and it could very well be as Ehud is dealing with the Moabites in southeast part of Israel, that Shamgar is dealing with the Philistines in the northwest part. So these things are happening simultaneously to one another. And all we know of Shamgar is that, Shamgar is not a Hebrew name, and so maybe he lives in a place where there's a lot of pagan influence, so that's where his name comes from. His father's name is very closely related to a Hittite goddess, and so Shamgar seems to be coming from the wrong side of the tracks. He's able to defeat 600 Philistines with nothing but an ox goad, which is just a big stick with a little metal point on it that you use to move oxen around. This is not a warrior's weapon, but rather it's the tool of a peasant. So we maybe could argue from his name and from his tool that maybe he's not coming from the same kind of family background as Othniel. He's coming from the wrong side of the tracks. And that sort of reminds us of a couple of different points we can make from this first cycle of the judges. Is that first, the men that God chose, and next week we'll see women that God chose as judges, were all very different from one another. Othniel comes from a very private, a very public family, a very famous family, and would have been recognized right away. Shamgar, on the other hand, seems to come from the wrong side of the tracks. Ehud had this that some people would have considered to be kind of weird, to be left-handed, and yet God calls them even though they're very different. And that's simply the way God always works. He calls and uses people that can be radically different from one another. Just think about the apostles that Jesus called. So Jesus is going to get a group of followers together as his closest associates that he's going to mentor for 3.5 years. And he doesn't choose a single religiously trained person. David, Reggie, I kind of take that personally, right? He doesn't go to the seminary and choose one of us who've studied the stuff. He rather chooses someone that's a blue collar, the fisherman. But not only does he choose a lot of fishermen, blue collar Palestine workers, he also chooses a tax collector who would have made the life difficult for the blue collar hard workers. But not only that, he chooses a zealot whose job it was to slit the throat of the tax collector that made it life hard. These are really different guys. They have very different talents, very different backgrounds. I think that's one of the wonderful things that the Chosen sort of reminds us of, is these these apostles are really different. They have personalities, and they're very different personalities. And we can't say that those personalities are exactly the same as the folks in the Bible, but it reminds us that they would have been very different people. And yet Jesus molds them into a force that would change the course of history as he sends them out into the world. That's the way God always works. He chooses people that are different. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 4, there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone is the same God at work. And then he goes on to use the illustration that we all have different gifts, just like our bodies all have different parts that work together. He makes the observation, the hand is a very important part of the body, but it wouldn't be very helpful if everything about our bodies were just one big hand or a bunch of little different hands. That would not get the work done. We need the feet. We need all parts of the body. We're all different, but we all work together to accomplish the same goal. That's what God calls us. And when we look at one another, we may be radically different in our backgrounds, in our assumptions, in our theological understandings, in our politics, and whatever way that you look at it, we're radically different. But God can use that differentness in order to accomplish His will. Not only were these judges very different, they were also very faithful. One of the stories we're going to see a little bit later has a moment and explains that moment in a little more detail, but all of these judges had that moment, right? Where God in some way, either directly or through an angel or through a prophet, says to Othniel, Othniel, I choose you to free Israel. Ehud, I choose you to free Israel. Shamgar, I choose you to... And at that moment, they had to go, oh, me? Now, see, we have that fleshed out in the Gideon story, right? Gideon, as we're going to see in a later lesson, is going to negotiate with God. Well, how do I know? And well, that's not good enough. Give me another. But all of these guys had that moment where they had to decide whether they believed in God enough. Because you see, you've got to have faith. The text tells us that the Spirit of God filled Othniel. And Ehud had to have a great deal of faith to step into the very chamber of the king that was oppressing Israel and take the sword in his hand to deliver Israel. And Shamgar, 600 guys with a stick, that took a little bit of faith in order to do that. They had to decide whether they really believed whether Jehovah was the Lord God of Israel or not. And you know what? Every day you and I have got to decide that too. Do we really believe that God is in control? Do we really believe that God is all sovereign? Not just over the universe, it's easy for us to think that, but He is all sovereign over the details of my everyday life. Do I trust God or do I not? Here's what Paul says in Romans chapter 8 and verse 31. What shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Oh, we know that verse, right? We could probably quote or paraphrase that verse. The question is, do we really believe? Do we really believe that God is for us? Then there is no force on earth that can defeat us. Oh, they can kill us. They can maybe defeat the project that we're on, but God is in all and through all and will have victory over all. Do we really believe that if God is for us, that nothing can stand against us? That no force in heaven or earth, neither death nor life, all those things that he lists in this same context, can ever come against one who has been chosen by God? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Paul is saying God saved us through his son, but he doesn't just give us Jesus. He is going to give us everything that we need. As said earlier, everything pertaining to life and godliness, God gives it to us. Do we really believe that? That the power of God is at our disposal or not? In this story of the judges of Israel, we have this continual problem of the people of God thinking that God is really not that much a part of their lives where they can trust Him to take care of their crops and herds and families. Because they need Asherah and they need Baal, these fertility gods, to help them with that. And so then they fall victim to all of these conquerors. And then God calls these people to free His people, these judges, and they have to decide if they're going to trust God or not. Israel didn't know that God was enough to take care of them in their daily lives. The judges had to decide that God was enough to lead them to victory and to accomplish what He was calling them. Do we believe that God is enough to get us through the day? Is God enough to lead us to be the people that He's calling us to be, to have the influence on those around us? Is God enough? Do we trust Him? There's this great apocryphal story, which means somebody made it up, a legend of the Texas Rangers, and they loved it so much they made a statue to this legend. There was a town where there were two cattle barons, and their hands were having a war. And basically there was this border war, or this dispute war going on between these two factions, and the town was getting shot up every day. And sounds like something to make a good Netflix series or something. And the mayor of the town, in desperation, sends a telegram to the Texas Rangers asking for a division of Texas Rangers to be sent to put down the riot. Well, a couple of weeks later, not the Lone Ranger, but a single Texas Ranger rides into town, and the mayor of the town runs out in amazement, says, "You only sent one ranger?" And the ranger said, "One riot, one ranger." Do we believe that one God is enough for our daily lives? See, that's ultimately what Israel could not come to. They thought they needed all these other gods and goddesses, all these other helps. Do we believe that God is enough? Do we have the faith to believe that God calls each of us in our small way to step into His story and to be used in that story in whatever way that He chooses to use us? Is God enough? Let's pray together.